with solar panels, for example, there are heavy metals that are in those solar panels. For example, cadmium. How do you manage that material when it becomes a waste? Do we have the resources readily available today? Or what steps are we taking to make sure that we're prepared to manage that waste appropriately? If we zero in, for example, just on the cadmium, how do we make sure that when we're performing our waste profiling to dispose of that panel at the facility that will receive it, that we're performing the adequate waste profiling testing? And if you're doing the T-clip test on maybe some crushed glass, all you're going to get is glass, totally inert. Whereas if you're testing the metal, then you're going to get the hit of cadmium.
Right.
It has to be treated as a haz waste versus going into non-haz. Now, why do we care? Because it comes down to cost, right? If you've got to dispose of something as a hazardous waste, the cost elevates significantly.
Yes, it does.
It's a 2 or a 3x factor versus a non-haz waste. So there are serious considerations for the waste generator to perhaps selectively sample certain things that might not be an adequate representation of what that waste is.
Right.
If that happens, then it goes into a non-haz waste facility, and perhaps it doesn't have the adequate lining to protect groundwater and soil and the introduction of those metals into our drinking water resources. It's an interesting feature of this green industry that has gotten less focus.
Yeah, and I think there's 2 other avenues we can go with that as well in talking about the disposal of solar panels. I mean, right now, California is the leading installer of residential solar panels. And the first generation or 2 of solar panels are now starting to die off, and they're going to start hitting the landfills in large amounts. As of today, California really only has a couple waste facilities that are licensed by the state environmental agency to accept the kinds of metals that you're talking about into those landfills. The vast majority of the solar panels are getting shipped out of state to neighboring states where they're being disposed. So we're also adding in more carbon to the process to truck those exposures out of state. So we're adding more carbon into the environment on the front end, and then spinning to the post process where it's actually hitting the landfills. And to your point, is it going to the correct landfill? And if it's not, then that landfill owner is now going to get cited for accepting material which they didn't know was hazardous and had these metals in them like cadmium, but they're accepting it, they've accepted it, and now they're getting cited by the state and federal environmental protection agencies. And from there, if it's not handled properly in that facility, is it seeping into the groundwater? Is it traveling to adjacent properties? What are the negative effects that's going to have on the local environment as well? There's so much to digest in this process, and I don't know that anybody is specifically addressing those at present. And I think we just need to look at that. And from an insurance standpoint, how do you think the carriers are going to respond to this as we move forward? Or what do you think they're doing now to address those questions?
That's a great point, because as we all know, on environmental policies, if there's an intentional noncompliance with a law or a regulation, that's going to be excluded. If there's an unintentional violation, if you make a mistake, you're a generator and you just didn't know that you're disposing of haz waste, there might be a little bit more grace in interpretation of that policy language. But how is that going to affect coverage? How are carriers going to view that? Have you gone through the right protocols and done your diligence to perform the right waste profile sampling to make sure that not only it's going to the right landfill or the right receptacle, but it's also not going to jeopardize maintenance of your insurance policy? Mm-hmm. To make sure that you got coverage. And if there is an exposure that was fortuitous and unforeseen, you've got that protection.
Just projecting out a bit, if there are seepages and leaks of this hazardous material and it spreads, God forbid it hits groundwater and travels, I mean, the remediation costs, the lawsuits, I mean, it's going to potentially drive premiums through the roof for everybody, not just those individual businesses, but across the board. And so I'd be curious to see what the analytics are saying about, potential exposures down the road and how the carriers are looking to address those. And I know we've got models for, contaminants hitting groundwater and things of that nature, but this is an additional exposure that's now being added into the mix, which maybe we haven't quantified fully from an insurance perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we all know, insurance is somewhat of a lagging indicator. We're always being more reactive than we are proactive, and frankly, that's the point to having this conversation. And I want to make sure that everybody understands we're not taking a side. We're not saying that going green is good or bad. The point is, let's make sure that we're looking at this problem in its entirety, and we're making informed decisions on the best way to not only mitigate carbon in the atmosphere, but also to make sure that we're not causing some kind of collateral damage from our efforts to pursue this green initiative.
And I think if you look at traditional oil and gas as an example, after 100 years of oil and gas, we have a pretty good idea of what carbon does to the environment and the carbon coming from oil and gas usage. And we're understanding what those impacts are. My hope is we don't take 100 years to figure out what the environmental impacts are from going green. I hope we can get that process started quicker and understand it, because there are going to be some negative side effects. But I think the sooner we can understand what those side effects are, we can remediate and abate those side effects, right? And deal with those in a hopefully a more efficient way than we have with oil and gas traditionally over the years.
Yeah, so I'll bring up a great example there. It was an unforeseen consequence. We were looking at ways to make fuel burn cleaner, in particular gasoline. And what we decided to do is add these fuel oxygenates, and there were a variety of fuel oxygenates. Most people know MTBE. That was something that was added to fuel to make it burn cleaner and to help, clean up the air. Again, going back to my days as an environmental consultant, what we saw is this additive then caused a different consequence. It was very miscible in water. It dissolved readily in water. And once it hit water, it would migrate very quickly. And it caused, unfortunately, significant contamination to groundwater. So in our effort to pursue cleaner air, what we did is we actually contaminated our groundwater. Now, as an environmental consultant, somebody who got paid to go out and clean up groundwater, that gave me a job.
Right.
That was another unintended consequence that benefited my industry in particular. But the vast number of communities that would have contamination to their groundwater, it was a very damaging unintended consequence by the petroleum industry to try and do something that would have been for the greater good. Similar correlation to what we've got now with this green industry.